South Asia Scholars Meet is. It's been held since 2010. And it's a way of getting all scholars around the world working on South Asia, but especially from South Asia itself. And the idea would normally be to bring people from South Asia to wherever the conference is being held. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic this year, well, actually last year, since last year we couldn't do it. But we're very happy that many of you could still join us via this virtual platform. So thanks to everybody who can make it today, and especially thank you to Professor Samadar for being here. Also, thanks to the Albert Hirschman Center for Democracy, the Department of International History and Politics, the Anthropology and Sociology Department for their support in the organization of this conference. And on their behalf also, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Ranabi Samadar, who is currently the Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies, Calcutta Research Group. He belongs to the critical school of thinking and is considered one of the foremost theorists in the field of migration and forced migration studies, spearheading the scholarship on South Asia. He's worked extensively on issues of forced migration, identity politics, nationalism, governance, post-colonial states within South Asia, neoliberalism, and new regimes of technological restructuring and questions of labor. The much acclaimed The Marginal Nation in 1999, his book, considered as a pioneering work on this genre of borders and migration studies in South Asia. And The Politics of Dialogue in 2004, these two were a culmination of his work on historical and social affinities, concept of nation state, borders, human rights, justice, peace, and autonomy. His most recent works include The Post-Colonial Age of Migration with Routledge, published in 2020. Among his other noted works are Migrants and the Neoliberal City from Orient Platform 2018, Karl Marx and the Post-Colonial Age, Ideas and Frameworks of Governing India, and Passive Revolution in West Bengal 1977-2011. He has also recently authored and published two important contributions around the life and politics of migrant workers due to COVID lockdown. And finally, he is also the founder member of the peer-reviewed journal Refugee Watch, and that is just a very brief introduction of our keynote speaker. Before I hand it over to Professor Samadar, just in the interest of a smooth program and to have maximum bandwidth, it's advisable that everyone keeps their mics and video. So without further delay, I'll just hand it over to Professor Samadar. Thank you.
Thank you all of you. And am I audible?
Yes.
Now, my thanks to the organizers of the Young South Asia Scholars Meet and the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, the Department of International History, both of the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Asia Society. When I got this invitation to speak on the everyday state, I was in two minds. At one level, I wanted to accept it immediately because I wanted to discuss and converse with the work that young South Asian scholars and South Asia scholars are doing. And this is something that, does not always, such an opportunity does not always come by. But on the other hand, I haven't really delved deep into the idea of the everyday state, the writings on that. I have some familiarity with the question of the everyday state formation and had quarrels with some of the leading proponents of the idea. So I was not very sure that whether I would be the best person to speak on the theme of the everyday state. But given my crooked nature and always trying to, turn all settled things into problems, I thought that maybe this is one more opportunity um, to place the notion of the everyday state uh, in an interrogating light, not to say that the idea of the everyday state is wrong, but to suggest that this is if the concept can be taken as a platform of several possibilities of directions in which our thinking may proceed. So it is in that spirit that I shall offer a few tentative remarks. And I know that the organizers had, I think twice, they wrote to me if I had an abstract and the title. And I must admit that, I didn't have the courage to, and I wasn't fully, in a way, I hadn't fully decided also how to approach the idea of the everyday state. Also, in the last 6 days, in Calcutta Research Group, we lost one of our founder members, a very dear friend, a personal friend of mine, Professor Pradeep Bose, who worked on the anthropology of the state. He was one of the past presidents of the Calcutta Research Group, and we lost him to COVID. So the last 6 days have been terribly unsettling for me. And so I wasn't actually given time to prepare the presentation in a more formal manner. So I seek apology to all the listeners here and the scholars who are attending this session. Now, I think I shall speak for maybe 30-35 minutes and then we can have a good discussion. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
That's perfect. Okay, thank you. Now, I reread, in fact, I read, I think more than twice, the concept note that you have circulated, and it puts succinctly what is meant by the everyday state. Also, it suggests some of the areas on which inquiries may be conducted, and you have invited papers. I hope they are published, or some of them are published at some stage, and I get an opportunity to read them. But this concept note, in fact, encouraged me to think little mischievously of the problem of the whole notion of the everyday state. Now, when you speak of everyday state, you have an implicit idea, or we have an implicit idea, that there is a state and how it functions on a daily basis. Functions in the society, functions as a social institution, and functions in relation to various groups, members, classes, estates of the society. Also functions in relation to others, daily relations. It also suggests that even though this present concept note doesn't tell, but it doesn't matter, because it also suggests that the state has to attain its legitimacy on a daily basis. The state is never secure in in being a legitimate institution. And so this takes us back to the old Athenian idea of the daily plebiscite, that the state has to re-achieve legitimacy continuously. The state can never say, my work is done. But nonetheless, with all these implications of the everyday state, uh, we have the idea that there is a state and then there is a society, there are members. Also, we have the idea that the state is being formed and reformed continuously, precisely through these relations with the society, other states, and members and fragments of life. And therefore, the everyday state as a concept can be better used or an uncertain has an uncertain existence. It doesn't have or it cannot have a once and for all defined meaning. Now, if you recall Hegel's idea, and this he wrote in a tract called the German Constitution 1798. So before the march of Napoleon and his victory over the European powers. But already at that time, the European conflicts were in the horizon, and Hegel said there is Germany, but Germany is no longer a state. And he continued, but anyone who tries to understand what normally happens in Germany by looking at the concepts of what ought to happen, namely the laws of the state, would be utterly mistaken. For the dissolution of the state can be recognized primarily from the fact that everything is at variance with the laws. He would likewise be mistaken if it took the form assumed by these laws to be the true ground and cause of this dissolution. He continued with the whole question of why people think Germany is a state, but why he thinks that Germany is no longer a state. He said that this is the concept which embraces all the others, is that Germany is still a state today, only because it once was a state, and because those forms whose inner life has now departed are still with us. The Germans have for centuries kept up a semblance of unity with the help of such general expressions, although no party has in fact renounced one iota of its claims to independence. And finally, reflection on this matter, particularly if it aims to be scientific, must speak to concepts, and in judging whether a country is a state, it must not waste its time with general expressions, but should consider what degree of power remains to that body which is called a state. So, in many ways today we can quarrel with Hegel, but this is the point that he was driving at is, I think, the gap. It provokes you into thinking what you consider to be the everyday activity of the state and assume that these are state functions, or these are forms of state functions, but forms which have taken other shapes. Do they cover the fact that there is no state? That in this neoliberal time, when reminding us of the Greek age or the Athenian age, which spoke of daily plebiscite, but today we can speak of daily adjustment. Adjustment of different competing possibilities. And therefore, as Foucault had said somewhere, I think probably in the birth of biopolitics, that government is a question of determining the ratio. Always you have, because the government operates in a society in the image of the market. And therefore, with the possibilities being offered by the market, the government has to continuously judge whether road X should be taken or road Y should be taken with regard to a question. And given the fact that government has to always decide the ratio between two possibilities, perhaps not ruling out one of the two, but trying to combine them, the government has to continuously calculate. And neoliberal time actually has forced on us a regime of calculation. You are continuously calculating. You are not only calculating to prepare a balance sheet, you are not only calculating the gains and losses of the competing alternatives. You are not only calculating the risk involved in that, because risk is an essential thing in managing the neoliberal society, but you are also calculating time. How do you invest? What is the time that you want to invest on? And therefore, you have the proliferation of what is called futures, trading in different times, but basically trading in time. Where is the state in this? I'm not saying there is no state, but all I'm saying is that one has to infer in the neoliberal era, the everyday functions of the state, the everyday state, in fact, whether it is something, we can mention two possibilities, and I will leave it to you to judge. We can say on one hand that these activities, these relations, which are being investigated under the notion of the everyday state, these relations do not tell us what the state is. The state might be found in another enter. Or we may say that this situation tells us that in the neoliberal time, the state in the form in which we knew, particularly the liberal forms, which means it would have a constitution, it would have laid down rules and regulations, it would have court, judiciary, it would have a proper security policy, it would have defined relations with other states, it would have citizens as the basis of its own statehood, and above all, it would exercise sovereignty. That while these features may remain nominally, but the state in the liberal sense is in the process of dissolution. And the everyday forms, the everyday reflections, the everyday activities, the everyday relations, these tell us, we think that they are telling us that there is a state, but perhaps, as Hegel said, that we use the word because this is simply a kind of memory that is still attached to us, and we cannot think of the situation in any other manner. And perhaps when we conceptualize the political society of our time, perhaps we may have to think of it along other conceptual directions. So there are, as I said, that the everyday state is a very fertile idea, and it should be taken as a platform of different interrogations and inquiries. And Hegel's remark, therefore, that people say that Germany is a state, but there is no state in Germany. That particular pamphlet, you may read the German Constitution written in 1798. It is, as I said, it invites you to think along other lines. But on the other hand, we can say that the problem that Hegel was addressing has been historically resolved. 200 years ago and nearly 225 years ago, Hegel was thinking of what the state can be and what is this idea of the state, because that was the time when liberalism was coming. And Hegel had therefore this idea of the sovereign state, state as the supreme idea, etc. And which has been now negotiated by anthropologists, sociologists, sociologically minded political scientists, historians of daily lives, as to how the state actually emerges in its everyday forms, implying thereby the relations, all that are involved in the making of the state. But given that liberalism worldwide is giving over to neoliberalism, the implication for the state has to be, I think, considered very serious. The liberal way to rule, as I said, that the liberal way to rule is well known. We all know. And one of the marks of the liberal way to rule was certain standardized daily practice. And precisely those 6 or 8 areas which you have indicated in your concept note, we may add a few to that, we may take out, but I think you have done it excellently, that these are the areas which we can make inquiry into and find out how the liberal state functions. But what happens when neoliberalism arrives? And my remarks are along that line of inquiry, and what it implies, therefore, for the theme that we are discussing today. And while I say briefly in the rest of my presentation what are the areas in which we can think further. It is important to note that neoliberalism would mean, among others, one, that the society doesn't turn into a market, but the society will be seen as a market. And neoliberalism does not turn the last person on the frontier into a productive actor, but neoliberalism would make it appear that the last person on the frontier is also productive actor. So therefore, for example, a physically challenged individual who in a liberal society would depend on family support or state support of different kinds, in the neoliberal regime or under the neoliberal regime, would be encouraged to do productive activity. And therefore, different kinds of contraptions would be devised so that the physically challenged person can also become a productive person. Or take the refugee. The refugee in the liberal era would be considered as an object of humanitarian protection. But the refugee in the neoliberal era would be encouraged to become an economic actor. So the camp, it will not be in the neoliberal, in neoliberal presentation of society, the camp is not an exception to the way in which society goes on. But the camp will actually reflect the way in which society goes on by being also a site of production. So you have therefore celebrity endorsement of refugee economic ventures, refugee made products, financialization and financial support to petty trades and production run by the refugees, and refugees and migrants becoming important cogs and wheels of the world, the global supply chain. We don't have to go into, other instances, save to remember the fact that neoliberalism would like the society to carry the image of a market, and therefore the last person on the frontier should be a market-enabled actor. If that is the case, then what would be the role of the state? While the state would retain its repressive functions, one may say that the state actually increases the arsenal of its repressive weapons, but at the same time, the state would allow societal negotiations of the problems that society faces. And the state would not like to be involved in the various social processes. The market rules, the market forces, the market tendencies should take care of the conflict. Only regulatory mechanisms, in other words, the regulations that are needed to make the auto-adjustment of social mechanisms possible, will be provided by the state. So if you take the case of India, let us say what is called TRAI, so the Telecom and the Regulatory Authority, SEBI, the Stock Exchange Board, you can go on naming the various regulatory bodies. And each new day you come up with a regulatory body, the regulatory body would regulate the market forces so that the society as a market can function. Classic case would be the vaccine distribution in India, where now the Indian state says that the different components of what you call the Indian state, so the state government, the municipalities, cantons, etc., towns, they should take care of the vaccine requirements they have. So, will there be a social principle? I'm not saying that the neoliberal state will say that there is no social principle. In fact, this will give the neoliberal state the additional ground to say that the social principle is only one of adjustment of different claims. No claim is inherently more just than others. So, to that famous query, Marx had once said that it was only after the instruments of torture were discovered that torture became a commonplace in society. Similarly, uh, it is only when you have these regulatory mechanisms that are put in place that they will force the social segments, the social entities, classes, individuals, gender, caste, races to quarrel and to readjust the relations. Now, this is evident in worldwide, in some cases pronounced, in other cases it is not so pronounced. But my idea, my hunch is that this will become one of the dominating features of the current neoliberal time. That being the overall scenario, the point would be, what are then the ways, or what can be the new blocks around which we can think of the relation between not only state and society. That's a very hackneyed kind of phrase. I'm not happy with that. But precisely the range of relations that you indicate by the phrase uh, uh, everyday state. The first question would be that the everyday state assumes, and correctly assumes, or I think it is based on the fact that the state requires a government. And the individual, the classes, the different social segments, they confront the state only through the medium of the government. And it is through the operations of the government that the idea of the everyday state is realized. You may say, object to what I am formulating and say that no, government doesn't mean a constitution, etc., all that I say, I agree. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that while the state, that's why I said the liberal state would assume a range of panoply of institutions, but these institutions finally govern the population, govern the society, and the society, the individual, the classes, the segments, they all confront the state, they all engage with the state, they experience the state through governmental activity. But this was something that we had learned from through decades and maybe 1.5 century of experiences of the liberal art of government, or the liberal way to govern. So when Hegel said there is no state in Germany, he was indicating thereby that why is it that the actors cannot come together to form a constitution, etc., etc. But what happens when the entire society is taken as a market, when crisis becomes the daily mode of living, when crisis doesn't appear before you as a breakdown of a system, but as chaos. And you know, in physics and in other sciences, you have a theory of chaos. We have in social science also a theory of chaos, but certainly not as strong and as clearly formulated as it is in the science. But we have now a situation of chaos, where the actors do not know what they aim at, what the state depends on daily management of the populations. And recall this famous, title of the book called Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste. So the crisis is not a danger to the state, but the crisis is an advantage to the state to readjust. And so it's like your permanent volatility in the market. Rupture, chaos, and crisis, these three words, if you put them together, they mark today's time. So the individual, particularly the lower orders, they are not very sure what the government means. I mean, think of the migrant crisis in India in 2020, which is being repeated, but in a less obvious manner. And think of the response of the government, think of the response of the people, think of the response of the court, the judiciary. You can see that it is only through emerging on the road, on the highways, that the migrants became visible. And the migrants started to be counted, began to be counted politically. But did the government invoke an act called the Migrant Workmen's Act, Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act of 1979? In fact, the Supreme Court said in the beginning, the migrants are being given food and water. What else do they want? The Solicitor General before the highest court of the land said that the government had no idea of how many people came out on the street and started walking or bicycling. The government didn't know for a long time how many people perished on the way. So, with a little bit of exaggeration, but I don't think it's an exaggeration, you can see that it's the picture of chaos. The state is not immediately worried about making the social order durable, and the state wants to learn fully the art of managing chaos. So, actually, there are some of the very, interesting ideas about what does crisis mean. I mean, you can say that crisis on one hand would mean that the ratio that I was speaking of, that the neoliberal way to rule is to constantly determine the ratio of possibilities, ratio of advantage and disadvantage, the profit and loss, the gain and risk, etc. That determination of ratio, that practice itself becomes subject to different uncertainty. And therefore, the idea that state gives you freedom is an idea that will not be substituted by a formulation that you are continuously servile to the state, that will not capture the mark of the time. Indeed, you may say that it is a time when you have freedom guaranteed by the state. This formulation is completely outdated. It makes no sense, precisely because the mechanisms of regulation, the mechanisms of economic intervention, they make the idea of freedom obsolete. you may also say that by governing the society in a continuously uncertain mode, by making society used to chaotic condition, you have actually announced that there is a crisis of the general governmental mode, that the assured functions of the government are now continuously put to question. I think there is another important implication of this thing, which is that this, as I said, this crisis of the liberal way to govern, people use the term governmentality, you may use it, Foucault made it famous term, but this idea of governmentality itself then is in a critical condition, precisely because government doesn't mean anymore an assured corpus of or a collection of modes of government. They are now continuously subjected to modification and remodification. So then this question will come back. And that's why I say that Hegel's formulation haunts us. Does the state have any essence anymore? And you have to ask, or we have to ask ourselves, when we say everyday state, do we imply that the state has an essence? Or do we say, look, the state has lost in its essence. It is only these everyday functions, or which we meet every day, but they are probably there, that they collectively make a different reality, but to which we are still giving the name state. And you may therefore say that the state is not a universal or an autonomous form of power. The state, on the other hand, is nothing but the effect, the profile or the mobile shape of a perpetual legalization, stratification of relations, but more importantly of shifts in finance, modes of investment, decision-making centers, and this is very important, and certainly the relationship between local forms of power and the central forms of power. Now, if this is the newly emerging or the emerging reality, as I said, we can see in the rough contours the emerging, the nature of, you may call it the new state or the state that is the liberal state that is being dissolved. We are dealing with, therefore, two kinds of historical knowledge. One, the old type of historical knowledge, where state meant certain institutions, certain types, certain legal acknowledgements, and certain ways of relating to society. We are endowed with that historical knowledge. And we are now in the process of acquiring new historical knowledge of controls and regulations, particularly regulations, which then perform the function of controls, regulations that today would define the task of government. It is still early to say the nature of the developing conflict between the old type of historical knowledge and the new type of historical knowledge. All we can say, as I commented a little earlier, that the old ways in which we saw the relation between individual and society through a theory of life is getting increasingly irrelevant. The way in which we conceptualize liberal society, again, the idea that opposite to liberal society is authoritarian society doesn't capture the reality. Or if we say illiberal, a term made famous by Rawls, but others also, then also we don't understand, because there is no liberal society in that sense. The liberal society is now a neoliberal society, carrying out its task of governance in a way where the state itself is gradually proving to be, less and less crucial to our life. Again, and you have to pardon me for referring so much to the time of COVID-19, the current epidemiological time, because in India we are living through that time, and the reality of the crisis, or the combination of three crises, the epidemiological crisis, the financial crisis, and the political crisis, together they make the crisis of COVID-19, which still continues, so overwhelming in our life that I know that I am developing this nasty habit of understanding everything through the prism of the time that we are passing through. So, in a way, we are back to what Walter Benjamin had alerted us to, that the bourgeoisie thinks that time is homogeneous, but time is not homogeneous. So I think we all are thinking in terms of the current COVID crisis, and you can see how far the state, that you have to honestly ask, the extent to which the state has been crucial in saving the life of people. What's the relation then, to put it bluntly, the relation between life and the state? Do you think, or do we think, that we are addressing this primal question of the time through our inquiry? That's the inquiry that our gaze must be directed to. Are the forms of the state, etc., are they becoming germane to the politics of the collective, the politics of the lower orders, the lives of the lower orders? And when you look or judge along that line, you can see that neoliberalism and the epidemiological crisis today, they have combined to expose the emperor. The emperor is actually me. Think of this whole concept of what you call what is hard immunity. Now, in some sense, government, Foucault famously said that the task of the government is to save life. Whereas earlier states were marked by their sovereign power to kill, to destroy life. And now, the state is legitimized and government's function is to save life. But for some reason, it would be a different occasion, I would need to discuss this, but for some reason, we ignored that all through these more than 150 years, Malthus and his ghost, they are alive. So when you speak of herd immunity, all you are saying, or you are calculating, and again I go back to the question of calculation, determining the ratio of how much lives you need to sacrifice to save how many lives. How many children have to die? How many old people have to die? Who should be vaccinated first? Where should you get your vaccines from? What should the state do in order to acquire all these things? What do you do meanwhile? Should you lock the economy? Should you unlock the economy? Should you unlock it in a gradual manner? And I can go on and on, write a full page on the different possibilities to address only one question, and only one. What will be the condition or the status of life in this epidemiological time. Where are we in this situation? We are left to ourselves. The state which was known as the welfare state, and therefore the entire sociological, anthropological, all those inquiries about relations of individuals to state, etc., and law. I shall come to that in a moment, and I will conclude very soon. That these are again the areas, as I said, we have to rethink it. Therefore, as I said, the new type of historical knowledge that we have, which is returning to us some of the knowledges of the past that we were not taken into account into the received discourse of the knowledge of the liberal way to rule. As I said, Malthusianism, as you know, Hannah Arendt wanted to revive the question of life again. And he said that the life as politics, life as activity, life as biological, these all have different connotations. And life has been recalled again and again by philosophers. Marx dealt with the notion of life enormously. If you are interested, please consult Grundrisse. You will see that Marx is wrestling with the question of life when he is discussing the formation of the working class and the determination of workers' wages, the question of surplus value, etc. And Marx is saying that at the core of the question of the worker is the core of how much life can produce, so that the society, and that's what Marx theorized about surplus value. On the other hand, how much the worker can produce so that the society can go ahead. And he said, at the root of all these things is the question of life. So, liberal society and liberal thinking had placed the reason of the state and the reason of the government in a specific relation. These two reasons were not same. But on the other hand, these two reasons were not different. And it's not that one was derived from the other. So it's not that government was derived from the state. The reason of government and the reason of state, they're extremely linked, but you make a difference. But what is happening is that the conventional account of the reason of the government, which Foucault and others, and following Foucault, many others have explained as governmentality, and the reason of the state, which from Machiavelli and Hobbes onwards to Jews, we have all discussed, both are now in the process of mutation. Because, as I said, that there is a phenomenon called biopolitics from below, that there is political initiatives and there are life conducts of lower classes in a manner where the political conduct of the lower classes in a manner where the life question is being articulated in a different manner. So the articulation of life, where do we place the articulation of life in this whole research engine? As I said, in this platform, which is extremely productive in terms of taking our inquiry forward. And it is not that biopolitics from below is a permanent phenomenon, but it emerges in front of our eyes only at specific junctures, namely the moments of crisis, the moments of chaos, the moments of rupture, and therefore when the governmental orders, governmental techniques, old techniques seem to be completely at loss. Add to that the major, or probably the most important function of the state, namely security. Where do you place security in this platform known as the everyday state? The liberal way to rule would tell us of macro security. So you have borders, you have boundaries, you have border security forces, you have armed forces, you have security laws, etc. And we think that through all these, we will be able to make society secure. And you have also the formulations of liberal thinkers, not only liberal thinkers, but critical, that rights are ensured only by guaranteeing security. You cannot have a right in an insecurity. You can't claim right in the condition of a war. In the condition of a war, all liberalism can do is to tell you that there are laws of justice, that there will be Geneva Conventions, etc. So, but security, therefore, the security architecture, the global security architecture, and the national security architectures, they will depend on a particular way in which security is considered. What happens when precisely if your idea of the everyday state takes you to what I term as, and with along with one of my colleagues, we termed as the micro insecurities of society, where each segment is insecure of the other, where you think that your right will be attained only only when you disallow the right of others. And this is precisely the market scenario, that all cannot be gainers. All can be gainers only at certain point of time, at very exceptional moments. But the market would mean always profits for some and losses for others, or less profit for others. So if you look at the histories of enmity and friendship, I am again thinking of the northeast of India, on which we have written, a number of times. If you look at ethnic conflicts, if you look at many other conflicts in society, you can see that these conflicts not only congeal past histories of enmity and friendship, but they also tell us that how a policy of macro security produces micro insecurity. Machiavelli, in fact, in The Prince, told how to govern depends on how one has acquired power. So, if everyday state, the experiences of everyday state tells the state, tells the citizens, tells the populations, how should the state govern? Or let us say how the state governs, then what the everyday narrative will not tell us, will in fact cover, is how one had acquired power. So, therefore, this very important idea, if you have, and Machiavelli dealt with it in Prince, that if you have acquired power by conquest, he didn't say that you would not acquire power by conquest, but if you acquire power by conquest, then the nature of the power would always be such as would compel you to continuously secure your power by securing your conquest. You may acquire power through hereditary means. You may acquire power through plebiscitary means, elections. You may acquire power by, transfer. Classic would be the Indian case when there was a transfer of power. But it was also combined with independence, etc. So how you acquire power leaves its durable imprint on how you want to govern and how those who are governed relate to those who govern. And it is important in understanding how you acquire power, because in making the society the theater of micro insecurities as a product of your policy of continuously trying to achieve macro security, that you continuously depend on what you may call the networks of power. So the liberal state could ignore the networks of power. The liberal state, you could say, had emerged only by breaking clan networks, or let us say, at least the myth would go tribal networks, or let us say caste networks. But as neoliberal politics proceeds, you can see different networks of power become important in giving shape to the government. If this is how the state will be functioning, then within the state, you have the permanent virtual presence of sedition and wrath. The state is always in sin. So the everyday state has to be a study of everyday seditions and everyday. And therefore, you can see when the state is continuously faced or faced permanently with the specter of seditions and riots, the state no longer has a reason which is distinct from the imperial reason of rule. We thought that the modern state, nation state, liberal state, they all graduated from the imperial form of rule. You may find that the problems of life, the and population within a technology of government, actually these problems force the convergence or the return of the imperial theme in today's, the reason of the state and the government. Last point, which is law. That do we leave out law in our account of the epidemic? And my unqualified and uncritical suggestion is that we have to include law. Law is no longer the province of the judiciary. I mean, if you think of Rohit's fantastic book, A People's Constitution, the Everyday Life of Law in the Indian Republic, you can see that some of the things precisely that you are addressing as the question, the phenomenon of the everyday state, policing prohibition. Think of the early 50s, Indian government tries to impose prohibition. This is one of the ideals of the constitution. Commodity control and market governance. The Indian state has developed modes of governing the markets. The question of decency in human life. So the butchers have to be invisible. You cannot kill the animals publicly. That you cannot solicit sex openly. But on the other hand, you also know that your right to work is guaranteed in many ways. So prostitutes may say that we are honest. Why are you making a mistake? And certainly in today's world, as I indicated, the court rulings on pandemic and migrant labor. In fact, one of my esteemed colleagues, Kalpana Kanaviran, has worked and is working on what she terms as the pandemic jurisdiction, the jurisprudence. So I think jurisprudence has become so much of a negotiating space that Rohit's idea of a people's constitution, or at least the question that jurisprudence has become an insurgent space, where things are being defined and redefined, where constitution guarantees state and lays down modes of governing, is becoming an old idea. So I think I will stop here, but all I suggest is that I go back to my the point that I raised in the beginning, that the everyday state is a very productive idea, provided that we do not take it in a formalistic manner, but take it as a productive platform which will produce different inquiries and inquire, in fact, interrogate what we mean by everyday and what we mean by the state. So, is there a state anymore? The way every day the state functions. We'll come back to this question. We are forced to come back to this question again. So, thank you.
Thank you so very much for that brilliant lecture. And I'm pretty sure that our viewers here would have much to say about and to address. Before we open the floor for questions, I would just like to say how provocative this lecture was. And thank you so much, Professor Samadar, for situating this broader line of inquiry from bringing in Hegel and Hegel's provocative question as to whether there is a state in Germany, to drawing us to the Athenian context, bringing in Foucault and there are 2 or 3 very interesting things that I thought about this lecture. One was about the regime of calculation, which I think is a very provocative way to even situate some of the questions that might come to us a little later from the participants. But also, as you said, to interrogate what is the everyday, what is the state, and also look at them as platforms for different interrogations and inquiries. And I do not want to take too much time here, especially because you've given us so much to think about. The question about what happens to the everyday state when neoliberalism arrives. What are the areas in which we need to look at when we when we talk about the everyday state in the current time that we're in, and most importantly, even the focus on time and calculation, the relationship between life and state. These are all. There's so much to unpack and so much there, and it was such a provocative lecture. We thank you, Amal and I, and the Hirschman Center and the departments as well. On behalf of everybody, we thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful lecture. To our participants, to our attendees, please let me know whether you have questions. I'll be taking in questions now, and we'll have a queue. So if there are a few questions, then we'll take them one by one. If there are many, we'll collect them and give them to Professor Ranabir Samadar. For our viewers from YouTube, let me know. Please write on the comment section if you have questions, and we shall pick them out. So the floor is open for questions and discussions. And could we have the first question, please? You're welcome to either use the raised hand function, or if you would please, you can even introduce yourself, pop in, and ask your question. Okay, considering that, well, the others are still waiting perhaps to look into, to gather their thoughts and collect questions, I'll perhaps ask you a question, or rather perhaps invite you to speak a little more about this determining the ratio, because I think it's such an important question that you talk about. Every time the state has to go through the question of what to do and what not to do. And especially in this current epidemiological time, I'm wondering, what does life constitute in these spaces? And it's something you hinted at and you spoke about as well. And how do we then look at everydayness in these contexts? So if you could just let us know a little bit more, especially because sometimes everyday narratives are also co-created perhaps and rapidly constructed. So in these contexts, how do you then look at the regime of calculation? Could we then say that even everydayness is also a matter of is also calculatively produced, perhaps? And in the meantime, Krishadu, you can type out your question or even ask it directly.
Thank you. As I said, that the regime of calculation has to be seen in the light of my remark that the society has to be seen in the image of a market, which offers you several possibilities. And market is a relation. At the same time, you must be producing something, you must be trading something. In other words, you have to become a market-enabled actor, an actor who can access the market. Now, therefore, you have to continuously do with what you may call pricing. How do you price your product? You are always faced with the possibility of doing less or doing more. And calculation, therefore, becomes extremely important. So today's discussions, all those things about artificial intelligence, think of the big data, the syndrome of big data, where what is the road you should take? You are driving a car, and you are instantly told, that's the way you should go. This is the road you should take. Big data would tell you many things, many things. So what is big data? Then again, you can see this is something which is on the basis of artificial intelligence and obviously algorithms. It's always telling you, this is the way to do. This is, you can do. This is the optimum solution, etc. So our classical idea of state, government, as I say, that I'm not saying they're out, but it's a reality that is changing, that is transforming, that is taking a new shape. And therefore, your everydayness is also, I'm not simply saying that it's a social construction. It is, but then everything is. So I'm not adding anything by saying, but what I'm trying to say is that behind what you see as everydayness, you may see another, meta reality coming up. So, for example, when Marx was studying the economic world and the political world of his time, Marx actually thought that all that we are seeing as political or economic phenomena, this is like a cover. That you pull the cover to one side and you will see the reality, which is dark, which is black, which has insects, which has so many things, unsavory things which we don't want to speak of. The enormous violence in the society, violence in the relation between the producer and one who is taking, violence in the way in which your life capacity is being used, the worker's life capacity. So it is in that sense I'm saying that what you see as everydayness, the everydayness is there. But as our inquiry proceeds, we have to see what do they add up to, or what they add up to, is it only the thing, or behind the so-called everyday, behind this fragmentary, this scattered all those things, there is something else. So when I said that Hegel's, intriguing formulation, there is Germany, but there is no German state, he was precisely trying to allude to this reality. But I said that the problem that Hegel raised has been in some sense historically resolved today, where you have a situation where you can say there is a state, but there is no state. That the daily negotiations and the daily regulations and the daily calculations of different possibilities and different ratios are now managing the society. Precisely because the neoliberal idea is to manage the society in the shape of a market.
Thank you so very much. We have a couple of questions and I'll read them out. The first is from Krishanu. He asks, how important is an algorithmic rationale for the functioning of the contemporary state, and what are the consequences of this for the notion of life?
The notion of?
Life.
Can we take them together? So maybe...
Sure. Yes, absolutely. And then we have a second longish question. May I ask it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So this is a question from Sunny Kumar. He asks, you provoked us by asking the question, is there a state anymore? Is the amorphous nature of neoliberal related to changes in capitalism, that is, shift towards dominance of global finance, capitalism, venture capitalism, where capitalists own the conditions of possibility of production rather than a product or a sector? The state then is responding to the amorphous, all-pervasive nature of capital and trying to ensure the conditions of possibility. So those are two big questions that we have.
I think I gave short answers to both of them. At one level, the artificial intelligence it will depend on how much and what you put into the machine. So with all the information-centric developments in India, the Indian government could not guess that uncounted and uncountable number of people would come down on the road within 5 days of the declaration of the lockdown. The different model making exercises on life, I'm not saying they are wrong, but I'm saying that the important question here would be that perhaps we may say that when we speak of biopolitics from below, that this unpredictable nature of the life capacity of the lower classes begins where actually the governmental modes of controlling or managing lives ends. So migrants were advised, and initially government of states, municipal authorities tried to force the migrants into staying in the cities where lockdown had been imposed. Classic case was the case of Surat, where workers died because there was fire. So it will all depend on how much you have thought. But on the other hand, and because you are always thinking only in terms of a certain chain, but you are back to the classic Leninist question, what happens if the chain has very weak links? Lenin was famously coined the phrase of the weakest link in the chain. So what happens if a link is very weak? That's the crisis point. And I think we have to advance a little further, and as I brought in the question of chaos, that chaos is not breakdown. Chaos is a particular state of existence. It's a chaotic way, and this disorder is the mode of managing society. And the challenge would be, how do you come out of this disorder, which we term as chaos? The disorder is a bad word because disorder is only looking in the image of order. But chaos is something which is, whose order we don't have the capacity to figure out. So the world appears chaotic to us because it is random. It is completely random. So if that is the condition, I know that I'm putting it in an extreme form, but if that is the condition, how will you respond every day? Your response will also be unpredictable. That's why I say that the possibility of sedition, the possibility of riot, that virtuality is within this physicality of the uncertain way of ruling. This physicality, this materiality is producing the virtuality, the virtual possibility of sedition and riots, precisely because you are basing your governance on an acknowledgement that it is an uncertainty.
That was absolutely fantastic. We now have a couple more questions. So Kostov K says, a fantastic speech. First question, what could be the cause of politics in India, especially in the context of the onset of the pandemic? I would be interested to know Professor's idea on the future strategies of the opposition parties, especially the left, in the backdrop of COVID. The second question he asks is, are the everyday lives of migrants and rural people double jeopardized in the context of faulty vaccination policy and the conduct of election of the state? Would you like to take this, or should I go on with the next question?
Yeah, please.
All right. And then we have Atiya, who follows up on some of the comments you made earlier. She asks, Many have highlighted the similarities of COVID crisis and especially the impact on migrants to the displacement of partition. Would Professor Samadar say India has become or was always a neoliberal state? And then we have a few more questions, but maybe these two, and then I'll bring in the next two.
The second one, yes, people have written, if you're interested, Women Unlimited has published a book of mine very recently called A Pandemic and the Politics of Life. So you can, if you want, you can read that, and how I look at biopolitics from below, what I mean by politics of life, and how pandemic should be viewed as a meeting point of several crises. All those things are there. And there is the history of pandemic and the history of other crises. If you think of migrants, for example, coming out on the road, and refugees walking in the wake of the partitions, there are very interesting writings done by one of my colleagues at Calcutta Research Group, Dr. Shamata Vishwas, who writes in details. We are also publishing a book edited by three of our colleagues on migrant labor, COVID and migrant labor. Now, these explore certain directions, but the Nehruvian state, the welfare state, the state which thought that it could run the economy in a planned manner. There was planning institution, planning commission, state planning boards, all those things were there. Now, the dismantling or the succession of the liberal state to a neoliberal way of ruling was gradual. People or political observers took time to understand. And many of the ways in which India is governed draws from long Congress, the history of Congress government, particularly from 2004 to 2014. And today, you can say that India has become a neoliberal state. But I must say that neoliberal state doesn't have an ideal time. I mean, the ideal type is a Weberian kind of thing. But on the other hand, neoliberal state, there are certain crucial things, but certainly its combination with globalization, nationalism, as I mentioned all the, how to run a chaotic society, how to transform the society in the image of a market. So all those things are there. As to the vaccine policy, of course, people are jeopardized. There is nothing to say. There was the myth believed in by many Indians that COVID will not affect the villages, but that myth has been busted. We know how many, in countryside also people are dying. And the left parties, I think I would not like to comment on that because clearly, I will only make one comment, but I really do not want to comment on that and hurt anybody's feelings or etc., loyalties. 1920 was the year when the AITUC was founded, the All India Trade Union Congress. And 2020 was the centenary of the All India Trade Union Congress. And when millions were on the route, migrant workers, where were these trade union organizations? It's not that they didn't respond, but clearly the response was inadequate, absolutely inadequate. By a conservative estimate, about 800 to 900 people died in the migrants coming out, and probably 100 people died on the trains, which was called the Sonic Station. And while life was being saved, at least that was the claim, that the government was saving lives, and therefore the lockdown But the same life was being repressed also, suppressed also. So the explanation of the All India Trade Union Congress that they were not prepared for this situation, I don't think it's a falsehood, it's true. The trade unions were not, the conventional forms of saving lives proved to be inadequate to the situation. The life question was re-articulated. Think of the different juridical explanations of what life is. Think of Article 21 in Indian Constitution. Right to life. Right to life has at least 10 to 12 formulations, including right to die in dignity. These are all Supreme Court judgments. So what does it mean when we say that this is a life question? What does life mean? And this is the most important question that has been raised by the pandemic. And if you ask me, was the left movement prepared or is it still prepared to address the life question? I think, we have to ponder. Probably it will take, I don't know, but we have.
Thank you so much, Professor Samadar. I must tell you, you have a wonderful way of weaving together these heavy things and making them so palatable in crafting your responses. It's just wonderful to listen to you speak. We have another question from Alessandro Ambrosino. He writes, my comment/question is more theoretical. I found your lecture absolutely brilliant in the many references to Machiavelli and his theories on the realism of politics in the formation of the modern state. I was fascinated about the reception of the Italian philosopher in India's context. How would you judge his heritage in today's neoliberal state? In other words, why is it still important to look at Machiavelli's Prince in 2021, where the authority of the state is being eroded by neoliberal market rules? We have a couple more questions, but I think we have time. We just have time to take the last two questions that we have. So after your response, we have two more questions, and then I think we'll have to call it a wrap. Is that okay with you, Professor Samadar?
You can, tell the last two questions and at one go because we don't have much time.
Okay, so in that case, Sucharita from the Calcutta Research Group as well has asked you a question. And then I'll pick Amal's question for the last. So Sucharita asks, says, the lecture leads to a number of queries. I would really like to thank Professor Samadar for a provocative talk. I'll try to articulate a strand of thought that emanates from precisely the point that you make, which is, where lies the everyday state? For example, would you say the emergence of vaccine passport and other related tools lead to further reshrinking of borders and subvert the state system? If yes, where in here do you see the figure of the refugee or stateless persons in the context? Do we see here the obliteration between the citizen and the refugee? And the last question I would pick is from Amal. And she asks, drawing on what you said about the welfare state and piggybacking on Atiya's question about the neoliberal state, can one say that the neoliberal welfare state today and the state in general, whether in Europe or erstwhile colonies, is or has always been a response to capitalism / neoliberalism a la Polanyi, and welfarism is limited to a select few? So those are the big questions that we have. And I don't think we'd have the time to take any more questions. So the floor is all yours, Professor Samadar.
I think these are very big questions and these are big guns booming, so I will be minimal in my reply. I think it's true that the condition today that obtains obliterates or makes unstable the distinction between the citizen and the refugee and the stateless. So I think I agree with that observation. And as I said, that if you see the condition of citizenship, and which I indicated, that the relation of individual to the state in the form of rights is becoming less and less important. We had the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, but did that come of any use in the migrant crisis? Big no. So one can go on, and we can't simply put it to rulers' carelessness, but I think it's the general condition. If you may think of vaccine passport, it's in a way like, if you had gone, decades back, if you had gone to Israel, then if your passport had that stamp, you would not be able to visit certain countries. On the other hand, if you had gone to Sri Lanka or Pakistan 2 decades back, then you will be put to question. So this actually points out to the perennial security concerns, and these security concerns are not traditional. This security concern is connected to the mobile threats. The virus is a mobile threat. The virus, you can't say it is only there, that X number, that, So, I mean, it's like you are trying to figure out what was called in the AIDS literature, the narrowing down on the patient zero. Who was the first patient? As if it solves the mystery. Where from did this particular virus originate? From a lab or from, does it help? But it is clearly the security angle, and the security angle is a complex. It includes your physical security. It includes your security anticipating something that may come in the future. It includes security in terms of some of the threats from nature. It includes security, insecurity in your biological life. It includes your financial risk. So in many ways, the whole security question itself has undergone metamorphosis. So I think that is what I indicated when I said that a policy of macro security actually leads to micro insecurities all around. I mean, you may say tomorrow, you may have a vaccine passport, but then tomorrow you will come up with another formulation. Vaccine X is not reliable. You must have a vaccine Y passport. There is no end to this, and we have to live with that. I think the welfare state question is not only a question of welfare function, but also the way state wanted to project itself to the society, that it is a state that looks at the society as, first of all, as a body that is entitled with rights. And the rights question and the welfare question, they went together. So what you term as the Beveridge Plan, the first very big welfare plan for UK in the wartime, the Beveridge Plan, and then if you take the Marshall Plan reconstructs Western Europe with two simultaneous functions, conjoining them, the function of welfare and the function of rights. And therefore, the idea that individual rights guaranteed, market becomes the ideal way of managing society, these have always gone together. And therefore, as I said, the old problem is resolved thereby that do you need a state to guarantee your rights? Germany showed that Germany didn't have a proper state after the war, that it was Marshall Plan and very other reconstruction plans, that finally it had a basic constitution. But what it did, how did it achieve a state? Not really through constitution, but by guaranteeing not only individual rights, but by precisely building up a market economy, which would then stabilize the nascent state. Because in case of Germany, it could not claim its legitimacy by drawing on either the Nazi state or the Weimar Republic or Imperial Germany, the Bismarckian Germany. So that's why I began with Hegel, that's a classic instance of a state which is not conventionally produced, which is produced, in fact, the other way around. The head is below and your feet on the top. So I think the welfare question, you have to understand that the entire reconstruction of the state takes place on the basis of the guaranteeing of rights and by making welfare functions essential to state, because it is by performing the essential functions. It doesn't mean that the state is protecting everybody, that the state can claim that care is an important part of power, that no power is legitimate and no power is secure until and unless that power, which has given importance to security function, also gives importance to its caring function, protecting function. Which is why, again, the Geneva Convention, all that, made protection of refugees the function of the state. The state, when a refugee comes to you, the state has to protect you, irrespective of the fact whether the country from which the refugee originates is your friendly country or the enemy country. And finally, I mean, I think we have, I don't want to. On the question of Machiavelli, I'm not very sure what is the Indian reception, but I can only say that of course, you may say I'm reading it as an Indian. I would not deny that I am an Indian, but I don't think I had in mind. But I have in mind the problem of how do you conceptualize power in the time of a crisis? And that is the important question. And that's why I say that Machiavelli's question of how do you exercise power depends on how have you attained power. So Machiavelli is the classic Republican thinker, and as you know, the Machiavellian moment is the moment from which the history of republicanism begins. It's a question of how do you appear as a prince for the people whom you would save, the people whom you would rule. So Machiavelli is not saying you rule in the name of God, you rule in the interest of a certain class, you rule only for the rich. No, Machiavelli is saying you are ruling in the interest of the people. And the people can be conceptualized as people only when you are exercising power, not only in a disciplinary mode, but also in the mode of care. So that's why his famous phrase, you need to be loved. You may be feared, but it is not enough. Are you loved? And if you are loved and feared, then you are secure as a ruler. So it's a grammar of power which neoliberalism, you may say, has finally put it into possibility. Because now desire is being produced among the subjects in a different way. You do not have to love the people, the group or the rulers who are ruling you. But you should become a ruler. The desire in you would be there so that you can rule the market, that you can gain from the market, that you become an actor in the market. So the earlier grammar is therefore changed. The earlier problem was, how should the ruler be received by the ruled? No. Today the problem is, how should the ruled imagine himself or herself? That's where you have the classic delusion element that capitalism produces desire. And neoliberalism is an order that continuously produces this desire for accessing the market among its subjects. I think I have spoken enough, and I'm sorry if I haven't answered. I can't help.
No, but thank you so very much. This was a brilliant keynote lecture. We are greatly thankful to you. And, we take one of your provocative statements to heart, and we hope the next 2 days of the conference will actually, spearhead that way, as to looking at the everyday state as a platform of different interrogations and inquiries, to quote you. And to look at the everyday state as a productive space which invites us to think alongside other lives, as you said. So once again, thank you very much on behalf of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, the Department of History, International History and Politics, in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Amal and I are exceptionally grateful to you for accepting our invitation to deliver the keynote lecture. Secondly, for delivering this great lecture, and thirdly, for answering all of our questions and queries. We know it's quite late in India. It's almost going to be 7:30 p.m. So we thank you for your time. And Calcutta Research Group, and especially the ANSO department, there is a longer history I am given to understand with students coming in from the research group, but also the professors and you having collaborated in several projects. And we hope to keep the conversation alive and kicking through the rest of it.
Thanks so much. Will the lecture be available on the web?
So it should be. We've streamed it live on YouTube, so we can forward the YouTube link to you.
Yes, that would be so kind of you.
We will definitely do that. Thank you so very much. To all of our attendees, Amal would be sharing the spatial chat link. So for those of you who would like to join us on the informal spatial chat forum, where you can interact with participants, other attendees, we welcome you to do so. We understand that most of you are located in different time zones. So if there's no pressure to join us, but if you would like, then we are more than happy to speak with you in person. So with that, we conclude the second day of the Y-SASM conference. We have 2 more days to go, and we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Ramanathan.
Bye. Bye to all. Bye to all.
Bye.